Right now, at this exact moment, Ursula von der Leyen is sitting in her Brussels office staring at a document that represents the total collapse of everything the European Union has built over the past 75 years. The document is only 3 pages long, yet those 3 pages contain language so devastating, demands so absolute, and consequences so catastrophic that European defense ministers have been trapped in emergency meetings for 36 straight hours trying to figure out how their militaries will even operate next month. Because JD Vance didn't just announce a policy change, he didn't just adjust America's commitment to European security, he ended it completely, permanently, and with such brutal efficiency that European leaders are only now beginning to grasp how utterly reliant they had become on American protection, American intelligence, American military power. The panic spreading through European capitals right now isn't normal diplomatic concern. This isn't anxiety over budget negotiations or alliance management. This is existential terror, because what Vance announced 48 hours ago will force Europe to make an impossible choice within the next 90 days. Either surrender completely to American demands and accept a humiliating restructuring of the entire transatlantic relationship, or reject Washington's terms and discover whether European militaries can actually defend their own territory without American support. And according to the classified assessments now circulating among NATO commanders, the answer to that question is absolutely terrifying. For 3 generations, European security has rested on a foundation most Europeans never thought about and never questioned. American troops stationed across the continent, American nuclear weapons positioned to deter Russian aggression, American satellite networks providing the intelligence data European commanders rely on for every major operation, American naval forces keeping global shipping lanes open so European economies can function, American air power capable of establishing dominance over any battlefield within hours, American missile defense systems protecting European cities from external threats. The entire architecture of European defense had been built on one fundamental assumption: America would always be there. America would always pay the enormous costs. America would always provide the military capabilities that European nations chose not to develop themselves. That assumption is now gone, and the collapse happened so rapidly that European leaders are still struggling to process what just occurred. JD Vance had been signaling for months that major changes were coming to America's relationship with Europe, giving speeches questioning why American taxpayers were spending hundreds of billions of dollars annually to defend nations wealthier per capita than most American states. He had pointed out repeatedly that European nations had failed to meet their NATO defense spending commitments for more than 2 decades while simultaneously criticizing American foreign policy decisions. He had noted with obvious frustration that Germany had built energy pipelines to Russia while lecturing Washington about dealing with authoritarian regimes. He had observed that France positioned itself as a counterweight to American power while depending entirely on American intelligence networks and military technology, but European leaders had dismissed Vance's criticisms as political rhetoric, assuming that regardless of what American politicians said publicly, the fundamental security relationship would remain unchanged because it served American strategic interests to maintain a strong presence in Europe. They were catastrophically wrong about that assumption. What happened on March 5th, 2026 at 10:00 a.m. Eastern Time proved just how badly they had misread the situation. Vance didn't hold a press conference, he didn't deliver a dramatic speech, and he didn't make a public announcement designed for media coverage. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He sent a classified diplomatic cable simultaneously to every NATO member state in Europe, marked with the highest security classification. It was delivered directly to heads of government, bypassing normal diplomatic channels, and contained language so blunt, demands so absolute, and timelines so compressed that several European leaders initially assumed the document must be fake or a negotiating position meant to be walked back after. Discussion. It wasn't. The cable began with a single paragraph that ended 75 years of American foreign policy toward Europe. The United States had determined that the current security arrangement with European NATO members was no longer sustainable or in American strategic interests. Effective immediately, the United States was implementing a fundamental restructuring of its military presence in Europe, its intelligence sharing relationships with European partners, and its commitment to continental defense operations. This restructuring was not subject to negotiation, modification, or delay. European governments had 90 days to demonstrate concrete progress toward defense self-sufficiency. Failure to meet specified benchmarks would trigger accelerated withdrawal of American military assets and termination of critical intelligence sharing agreements. What followed were 47 pages of detailed implementation plans that would systematically dismantle the American military infrastructure that had protected Europe since 1949. 73,000 active duty personnel would be withdrawn from European bases within 18 months, and 47 American military installations across the continent would be closed permanently. 12 major defense cooperation agreements would be terminated. NATO command structures reorganized to remove American officers from leadership positions in European continental defense operations. American satellite intelligence sharing with European partners reduced by 60% immediately, and potentially terminated entirely if benchmarks weren't met. Signals intelligence cooperation restructured to require European nations to pay full cost recovery for access to NSA collection capabilities. And American missile defense systems currently protecting European territory redeployed to other theaters unless European nations agreed to cover 100% of operational costs. The list went on page after page, methodically dismantling every component of the security architecture Europe had relied on for 3/4 of a century. But the military withdrawal was only the beginning, because Vance's cable also contained a section on intelligence sharing that would prove even more devastating than the troop reductions. European defense officials had always known in theory that they depended on American intelligence capabilities, but they had never fully grasped the extent of that dependence until they read what Vance was threatening to do. At this exact moment, Ursula von der Leyen is sitting in her Brussels office, staring at a 3-page document that represents the total collapse of everything the European Union has built over the past 75 years. A document so short, yet so lethal in its language, so absolute in its demands, and so catastrophic in its consequences that European defense ministers have been locked in emergency meetings for 36 straight hours, trying to work out how their militaries will even function next month. Because JD Vance didn't merely announce a policy tweak or adjust America's commitment to European security, he terminated it outright, permanently, and with such ruthless efficiency that Europe's leaders are only now beginning to comprehend how completely they had come to depend on American protection, American intelligence, and American military power, and the panic racing through European capitals is not routine diplomatic anxiety or concern over budgets and alliance management, but something far darker and more primal, an existential terror born from the realization that what Vance announced 48 hours ago will force Europe into an impossible decision within 90 days. Either submit fully to Washington's demands and accept a humiliating reordering of the entire transatlantic relationship, or reject those terms and find out in real time whether European militaries can actually defend their own territory without American support, a question that classified assessments now circulating among NATO commanders answer with a conclusion that is nothing short of horrifying, because for 3 generations European security has rested on a foundation most Europeans never examined, never questioned, and never imagined could simply vanish overnight. American troops spread across the continent, American nuclear weapons positioned to deter Russian aggression, American satellite networks feeding the intelligence European commanders rely on for every major operation, American naval forces keeping global shipping lanes open so European economies can breathe, American air power able to seize control of any battlefield within hours, American missile defense systems shielding European cities from external threats. The entire architecture of European security had been constructed around a single unspoken assumption: America would always be There, America would always absorb the staggering costs, America would always supply the military capabilities European nations deliberately chose not to build for themselves, and that assumption has now evaporated. Its collapse so sudden and so complete that European leaders are still trying to comprehend what has just happened, because while the shock feels abrupt, JD Vance had been laying the groundwork for months, openly signaling that a fundamental rupture was coming and repeatedly asking why American taxpayers were pouring hundreds of billions of dollars every year into defending countries that, on a per capita basis, are wealthier than most US states. A question that Europe dismissed for decades, right up until the moment the answer arrived. He had repeatedly pointed out that European nations had failed to meet their NATO defense spending commitments for more than 2 decades, while still finding time to criticize American foreign policy, noting with barely concealed frustration that Germany built energy pipelines to Russia while lecturing Washington about how to deal with authoritarian regimes, and observing that France postured as a counterweight to American power while relying almost entirely on American intelligence networks and military technology. Yet European leaders brushed off Vance's arguments as mere political theater, convinced that no matter what US politicians said in public, the core security relationship would never change because it supposedly served America's strategic interests to remain deeply embedded in Europe, an assumption that turned out to be catastrophically wrong, because what happened on March 5th, 2026 at 10:00 a.m. Eastern Time exposed just how profoundly they had misread the moment, as Vance didn't call a press conference, didn't deliver a dramatic address, and didn't make any public announcement crafted for headlines, but instead chose a far more devastating move by sending a single classified diplomat cable stamped with the highest security designation simultaneously to every NATO member state in Europe. It was delivered straight to heads of government, bypassing normal diplomatic channels entirely, and the language was so blunt, the demands so absolute, and the timeline so brutally compressed that several European leaders initially assumed it had to be fake or merely an opening gambit that would be softened after talks. But it wasn't, because the cable opened with a single paragraph that brought 75 years of American foreign policy toward Europe to a dead stop, stating that the United States had concluded the existing security arrangement with European members of NATO was no longer sustainable or in American strategic interests, and that effective immediately Washington was implementing a fundamental restructuring of its military presence in Europe, its intelligence sharing relationships, and its commitment to continental defense operations. A restructuring explicitly declared non-negotiable, non-modifiable, and not subject to delay, giving European governments 90 days to show concrete progress toward defense self-sufficiency, with failure to meet specific benchmarks triggering an accelerated withdrawal of American forces and the termination of critical intelligence sharing agreements, after which came 47 pages of meticulous implementation plans detailing how the American military infrastructure that had shielded Europe since 1949 would be methodically dismantled, including the withdrawal of 73,000 active duty personnel from European bases within 18 months and the permanent closure of 47 American military installations across the continent. 12 major defense cooperation agreements would be terminated, NATO command structures reorganized to strip American officers from leadership roles in European continental defense, American satellite intelligence sharing cut by 60% immediately, with the option of total termination if benchmarks were missed, signals intelligence cooperation restructured so European nations would be required to pay full cost recovery for access to National Security Agency collection capabilities, and American missile defense systems currently shielding European territory redeployed to other theaters unless European governments agreed to cover 100% of operational costs, with the list continuing page after page in cold, methodical detail as it dismantled every pillar of the security architecture Europe had leaned on for 3/4 of a century. Yet the military drawdown was only the opening act, because buried within Vance's cable was an intelligence sharing section that would ultimately prove even more devastating than the troop withdrawals, confronting European defense officials with a reality they had long understood in theory but never truly absorbed. Until that moment, the sheer, overwhelming extent of their dependence on American intelligence capabilities, and how quickly that lifeline could be severed.